And now let's go to another continent. We go to Brazil, and we will travel to our country, and I will tell you something about the history of our country and how all the culture is linked with Brazil. So the title of presentation is Wood and the Forest Culture in Brazil. Man concerned the one historical species, which name is Cisalpina equinata, Brazilian wood, and the connection of those species with the history of the country. The topics that we will explain go through the first settlement of the continent and Brazil, the wood and the forest culture, the period preceding the arrival of Portuguese, and the arrival of Portuguese in Brazil, the first forest activity, and Brazilwood and botanical science, characteristics of these three species, Brazilwood utilization, current situation, and conclusions of the presentation. One important aspect that Brazil is the only country in the world that has the name of a tree species, Brazilwood. You can see the figure, a very old painting that shows some indigenous people cutting Brazilian tree, Cisalpina equinata. Let's go to the first settlements in the continent and also in Brazil. It is considered that human occupation in South America occurred about 15 to 20,000 years before Christ. So our civilization is much more younger than if you compare with African countries. Archaeological research in Brazil record evidence of a human presence taken back to 10,000 years BC. Hunters and fishermen, for thousands of years, the indigenous began to develop agriculture, small animal husbandry, pottery from 7,000 BC. These activities were the basis of formation of sedentary groups in America. The indigenous people used wood and other materials collected from different tree species from the forests. And the different wood species were extracted for specific applications, like in Africa and other countries, either for canoes, weapons, fire, construction of primitive houses. The straw was used to make baskets, mats, nets, and other objects. For the manufacture of arrows, the indigenous people used normally dense wood and bamboos. And for arch used high wood density and resistant to twisting. For houses and structures, for protecting people, they use large trunks with natural resistant to decay organisms. And for building canoes, they use lower wood density and sometimes thick bark taken from certain tree species. So you can see some figures explain about what we're talking. Also, for manufacture of some utensils, like cables, axes, maces, they use a very high wood density with hardness and resistance to shock. For a common wood application, were selected different tree species, but with similar physical-mechanical properties. Some figures, you can see some S's and arcs and arrows. Nowadays, the analysis of anatomic structure of wood species and wood objects can provide a correct identification of the three species. And you can also confirm the ancient and traditional knowledge of indigenous people in order to choose the better species for a specific application. So low wood density, you can, of course, to do canoes, arrows, etc. For high wood density, you can prepare arch, axe, and other utensils. In the period preceding the arrival of Portuguese, the indigenous people in Brazil were grouped according to linguistic roots in three geographical regions. And at that time, the population was estimated in between 3 to 6 million people, including 1,500 ethnic groups. The Portuguese arrived in Brazil, and the first connection with the indigenous people occurred in April 21, 1500. That time, the Portuguese were seeking for natural products and to carry to Portugal and other countries of Europe. The people, indigenous people, transmitted to Portuguese how important and for the daily activity a new wood species, that time we call Brazilian wood. They observed that wood species were very abundant along the coast and the rivers of the new country. And this species that time replaced a very important sappan wood, called sappan wood, Cisalpina sapam, native from Asia and imported in limited quantities that time. The wood, Brazilian wood, was also useful and important to furniture and for ships construction. And the Portuguese used the indigenous people to harvesting and transport logs of Brazilian wood to the ships. So it was estimated that each year more than 200 up to 5,000 tons of wood were cut and transported to Portugal. So many and expressive quantities of Brazilian wood was used that time in Europe. One important aspect is under the monopoly of Portuguese, it was organized operation of shipping to transport logs to Portugal. And the rich commerce stimulated other nations to harvest and illegally transport wood, like some French expeditions invaded the colony that time for economic exploitation of Brazil wood. That time in Brazil, normal people, common people, do not cut trees, just the authorization of King of Portugal. The rules of King of Portugal on the exploitation a statement that no person is authorized to cut or have cut the Brazilian trees. Otherwise, we will be punished with death and the confiscation of this land. There are some figures that you can see the external characteristics of Brazil wood that's common to Leguminosae family and belongs to the Cisalpinaceae subfamily. Why Brazil wood is a so important species today? The heartwood of Brazil wood was and is used also today to make violin bows for more than 2 centuries. And the main characteristics are the resonance, density, durability, build, and the best material for stringed instrumental bows. Concerning the botanic science and the Brazilwood, the first botanical literature that reported the species was did by Caspar Bauhin, a Swiss botanist, and who published a long list of Brazilian plants in the early of 17th century. And the French naturalist Lamarck described the main characteristics of naming the trees species Alpina equinata, which is still used until today. And the name of genus Caesalpina was given in honor to Andrea Caesalpino, an Italian physician, philosopher, and botanist. And the plant was also cited in the famous book did by Carl von Martius, De Flora Brasiliensis. Current situation of Brazilwood trees. However, in the 18th century, the excessive exploitation of Brazilwood resulted in the cessation of the harvest activity. Presently, the species is listed as an endangered species in UICN and also included in the official list of endangered species of Brazilian flora. Today, some sites where Brazilwood occurs naturally are legally protected, and new reserves must be created, and the surveys undertaken to locate remaining populations and evaluate their genetic and diversity mechanisms. And how to save the forests with high cultural value and historical and economic value. We have in Brazil a program to provide this planting of more than 600,000 seedlings in 5 years. Also, we have education campaigns coordinated by universities and the government of Brazil, involving students and partners aims to planting 2 million trees until 2020. The main conclusions of these presentations are wood and forest culture represent a strong connection with the history of Brazil, whose name is derived from the traditional Brazilian tree species Caesalpina equinata, heavily exploited by the early settlers. The culture of wood and forests is strategically linked to the economic, environmental, historical, and social issues of our country. It is fundamental the recognition of ancient customs directed at the rational exploitation of forests and the use of non-timber products. Thank you, obrigado. Ashanti.